African lady accidentally married the Arab billionaire CEO. Khadija rushed into the luxurious hotel event hall, her hands nervously tugging at the wedding dress that trailed behind her. All eyes were on her, and she could feel the weight of the gazes from every direction. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she hurried forward, her heart racing with anxiety. It was her wedding day. Her stomach twisted as the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. "Is he here yet?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The doorman, a tall man with a stiff posture, shook his head, his face clouded with sympathy. "No, Miss Khadija, he's not here," the doorman replied quietly, but his eyes spoke volumes. They were filled with the unspoken fear that her wedding day might fall apart. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. It was meant to be the culmination of her long and challenging journey. After years of trying to convince both her Nigerian parents and her fiancé's wealthy Arab family that their love was genuine, that it wasn't just about convenience or status, the approval had come through. And now, this was her wedding day. But why, then, was she feeling so uncertain? "Where is he?" Khadija muttered under her breath, feeling the weight of every eye on her. She had been raised in Nigeria, but for the last few years, she had lived in Dubai, trying to fit into a world that was far removed from her roots. Her African upbringing and her Nigerian family's values felt like they were constantly in conflict with the lavish Arab culture that she was now a part of. Her best friend, Hayat, a stunningly beautiful young woman who had become like family to Khadija, rushed up to her, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She was breathing hard, a concerned look etched on her face. "I've tried calling him," Hayat said, her voice laced with anxiety. "His phone keeps going to voicemail. Something's wrong. Could something have happened to him?" Khadija whispered, her mind racing with dread. She knew her fiancé, Tariq Al-Fayed, the CEO of a multinational tech company, had been under immense pressure lately. But he couldn't have. Before Hayat could answer, Khadija's mother appeared, her expression stern, the lines of her face hardened with years of strict tradition and control. "Khadija," she said, her voice clipped, "your father is almost here. We can't afford a scene. You know what's at stake here." Her mother's gaze flickered briefly to the side, acknowledging the weight of their family's reputation. Khadija swallowed hard, her throat tight. She was a woman caught between two worlds, the one of her parents' expectations and the one of her own desires. She had been trying to live up to both, but it was becoming more difficult every day. "I have to know where he is, Hayat. My parents are already here. If they find out that he's not here..." Khadija's voice trailed off, her stomach churning with a mix of fear and frustration. Hayat gave her a look, one that was meant to reassure, but it failed. "Khadija, we don't have time. We need to make sure this wedding goes through. For your sake, for everyone's sake." And just then, the doorman returned, his face slightly more hopeful. "Miss Khadija," he said, his tone lighter than before. "There's someone asking for you in the other hall. He says he's looking for you." Khadija's heart skipped a beat. "Tariq?" she asked, her voice rising in a blend of relief and confusion. The doorman's response was hesitant. "He didn't say his name. Just asked for you." Khadija exchanged a puzzled glance with Hayat. "Which hall?" she asked urgently. The doorman pointed down the corridor. "That way, miss. Just a few steps to your left." Without another word, Khadija turned and began to walk briskly towards the hall. Her mind was spinning. Could it be him? Or had something gone terribly wrong? As she walked, her thoughts were a blur. The golden decorations, the white silk ribbons hanging from every corner, and the sounds of soft chatter faded into the background. Everything felt surreal. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, yet it was happening so quickly, and nothing seemed to go as planned. Then, as she entered the hall, her eyes scanned the crowd. And there he was, a tall, strikingly handsome man with dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He stood at the far side of the room, his body rigid, his gaze intense. This wasn't Tariq. "Who?" Khadija's voice faltered, but before she could finish, Hayat's hand grabbed her arm, pulling her aside. "Khadija, your parents have just arrived. We need to go now, or they'll make this worse." Khadija's heart raced as she turned to face her parents, who were walking toward her with their stern, unforgiving expressions. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew one thing for certain. The man she was supposed to marry, Tariq, was nowhere to be found. And now, she was about to walk down the aisle with a stranger. Her parents' faces were grim as they approached, their eyes scanning her for any sign of a mistake, any flaw in the carefully laid out plan. It was their world, and Khadija was just a pawn in it. "Let's welcome the bride," The host's voice boomed over the microphone, and Khadija's heart skipped another beat. All eyes were on her now, and her only thought was, how did I end up here? Khadija's feet moved on their own as the music swelled, carrying her toward the altar. She had no choice but to follow the steps, her eyes locked on the man standing at the front of the hall. Her heart was in her throat, but she couldn't focus on the pounding in her chest. There was too much on the line. As she walked, she tried to steady her breath, but the weight of her parents' gaze on her back was suffocating. This wasn't the wedding she had dreamed of. The man she had imagined standing at the altar wasn't here. It was a stranger, an Arab man with a distant, almost unreadable expression. He was tall, with dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to flicker with curiosity, and he wore an impeccable suit that made him look every bit the businessman his reputation suggested. But that was all she knew about him. Who was he? And why was he standing there in Tariq's place? Just play along, Hayat had whispered to her moments ago. It was the only thing that made sense, but it felt like the worst kind of betrayal. A far cry from the true love she had imagined. The eyes of the guests, many of whom were strangers to her, flicked from her to the man at the front of the room. Some were curious, others were confused, and a few looked downright amused. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered in that moment was that she had to get through this, and somehow, they needed to convince her parents that everything was fine. Khadija's stomach twisted. She barely noticed when she reached the altar, her legs shaking under the weight of the situation. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the arm of the man in front of her. He was tall, dark-haired, and impossibly handsome, though his expression was one of careful neutrality. He wasn't the man she had promised herself to. He wasn't her beloved Tariq. Yet, he held her arm firmly, as though this moment, this forced marriage, was the most natural thing in the world. Khadija forced a smile, though her insides were screaming. Her thoughts raced. Who is this man? What is happening? The man beside her, Jamil al-Mansur, was the last person she ever expected to be standing next to her on her wedding day. He had the look of someone used to getting what he wanted, and yet, despite the striking confidence in his posture, there was something in his eyes that told her he wasn't happy about this either. You're going to be fine, Jamil murmured in a voice so low only she could hear. His breath brushed her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. Fine? How could she be fine? Her whole world had just been turned upside down. The guests, her family, Tariq's family, they were all watching. And then, the priest began the ceremony, his words a blur in Khadija's ears. It all seemed so unreal, like she was watching someone else's life play out before her. The priest's voice echoed through the room as he asked the traditional wedding questions. Do you, Khadija, take this man, Jamil, to be your husband? She couldn't answer. Her throat tightened, and she blinked back the tears that were threatening to spill. She could feel her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Jamil's hand squeezed hers, and in that moment, she realized something that made her feel even more lost. He was waiting for her response. He was a stranger to her, and yet here they were, standing in front of everyone, bound by some twisted sense of duty and familial expectations. The priest looked at her expectantly, and Khadija's mind raced. What am I supposed to do? And then, before she could think any further, she heard herself say the words that she never thought she would say, I do. The moment her voice echoed in the room, everything seemed to shift. The weight of the world, her family's expectations, and the pressure of this situation crashed down on her. She had just pledged herself to a man she had never met, a man whose life was completely unknown to her, all in the name of saving face. For her family, for her future, for a life she never asked for. Jamil's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, as though he was pleased by her answer. But there was something about it that felt wrong, like they were both caught in an act they couldn't escape. He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers, and then, without a word, he pulled her gently into a kiss. It wasn't the passionate kiss she had imagined with Tariq. There was no deep connection, no spark of love. Instead, it was brief, almost clinical, as though this moment, too, was just another part of the performance they were both trapped in. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers and claps echoing through the hall, and Khadija pulled away from Jamil's grasp, feeling like a puppet on a string. She fought to keep her composure, but her heart felt like it had been ripped out of her chest. As the ceremony continued, and they moved on to the next stage of the wedding, the reality of her situation sank in. She had married a man she didn't know, in front of people she barely understood. And her life, everything she had planned for the future, was now tied to a man who wasn't her fiancé. But despite her inner turmoil, she could feel the eyes of the guests on her. The judging looks of her family, the disapproval from Tariq's parents, and the quiet, yet firm, presence of Jamil beside her, who was probably just as lost as she was. And so, the story of Khadija and Jamil had begun. It wasn't a love story, but perhaps it would become one. She didn't know yet. All she knew was that her life had just taken a turn she wasn't prepared for. The ceremony carried on like a blur. Khadija could barely process the rest of the event. She stood beside Jamil, walking through the motions, listening to the laughter of guests, nodding politely at compliments and congratulations that felt like hollow words. Her mind was far away, caught in a storm of thoughts, all revolving around one question. Why was she here? The reception hall was grand, with towering floral arrangements and walls adorned with sparkling lights. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the soft hum of orchestral music playing in the background. Yet, to Khadija, everything felt suffocating, a spectacle she had been forced into, a performance she couldn't escape. Jamil, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. He stood tall beside her, offering smiles and shaking hands with business partners and family friends alike. He was the epitome of the wealthy heir, his movements smooth and confident, his sharp gaze never missing a thing. But there was something detached about him, as though he was playing a role he had long since mastered. As the night wore on, Khadija's thoughts wandered. She knew she had to find a way out, but at that moment, she was trapped. Trapped in a marriage to a man who wasn't her choice, her fiancé nowhere to be found, and her parents watching her every move. Khadija, Jamil's voice broke through her thoughts. His gaze was gentle, yet there was something unreadable behind it. I know this isn't ideal, but you've been brave today. She met his eyes, her heart heavy with confusion. Brave? How could she be brave when her whole world had been upended? I never thought I would end up in this situation, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. But here we are. Jamil nodded, his lips curving into a faint, rueful smile. Yes, here we are. But I think we're both doing our best to make it work. Khadija couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. Make it work? How could she possibly make this work? She barely knew the man beside her. She didn't even know if he was kind, if he was good, if he could love her. Her thoughts were interrupted when a guest approached, a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 30s. He had an air of importance, and his gaze lingered on Khadija for a moment too long before he turned to Jamil with a respectful nod. Jamil, the man said, his voice low, yet firm. I just wanted to say congratulations. I'm glad to see you're doing well, though I must admit, I didn't expect this, your choice of bride. Khadija felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks as she looked away. She hated that people were talking about her, judging her, whispering about her marriage to a stranger. This wasn't the life I wanted. Thank you, Khalid, Jamil responded smoothly, his voice unwavering. I appreciate your kind words. Khalid, however, didn't seem to take the hint to leave. Instead, he studied Khadija with interest, his eyes glinting with an unfamiliar calculation. She's beautiful, he said, his words deliberately slow, almost as if he were testing the waters. Khadija stiffened, feeling uncomfortable under his gaze. She didn't know if it was his inappropriate scrutiny or the feeling of being an outsider in her own wedding that made her skin crawl. She tried to smile, but it came out tight, forced. Jamil, noticing her discomfort, shifted his stance slightly, stepping closer to her. Yes, she is, he said, his voice low and firm, an edge of protectiveness seeping into his words. Khalid finally nodded, though his smile remained. I trust you'll handle things well, Jamil. You've always known how to navigate the waters. But remember, this is a business transaction as much as a union. Khadija blinked in surprise. Business transaction? She had heard the whispers of arranged marriages in the Arab world, but hearing it so blatantly stated made her blood run cold. Don't worry, Khalid, Jamil replied smoothly. I know exactly what I'm doing. But Khadija couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about Jamil and her. It was about something much bigger, a world of power, money, and influence that she had no part in, no understanding of. When Khalid finally took his leave, Khadija turned to Jamil, her voice a little sharper than she intended. What was that all about? This is just a business transaction to you? Jamil looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as if he would say something else, but instead, he exhaled and looked down at her hand where her wedding ring rested. In some ways, yes. This is more than just a marriage. It's about family. It's about reputation, legacy. There are expectations. Khadija felt her heart sink. She had known this marriage was born out of necessity, out of her family's expectations and his, but hearing Jamil admit it so plainly left her feeling hollow. "You think I don't understand that?" she asked, her voice quivering with the strain of trying to hold back tears. "You think I wanted this? To marry a stranger?" Jamil's face softened just slightly, though he said nothing. He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "No, I don't think you wanted this. I know this isn't easy for you, Khadija. But right now, we don't have a choice." Khadija stared at their joined hands, the weight of the ring on her finger suddenly feeling like a shackle. This wasn't a marriage built on love, it was a marriage built on obligation. Suddenly, the weight of the night felt heavier than ever. The people, the smiles, the celebrations, they all seemed so distant, so meaningless now. All she wanted was to be with someone who truly loved her, someone she loved in return. But that person wasn't here. "I want to go home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jamil's eyes softened. "You are home, Khadija." But to her, the words didn't feel like a promise. They felt like a sentence. The drive to Jamil's penthouse was a blur for Khadija. She sat in the backseat of the sleek black car, her gaze out the window as the Dubai skyline passed by in a dazzling array of lights. She should have been excited. She should have been happy. But instead, her chest felt tight with every passing moment. The weight of the wedding, the expectations, and the unfamiliarity of everything around her made it hard to breathe. She glanced at Jamil sitting across from her. He was composed, relaxed, and yet, there was something in his demeanor that told her he, too, was carrying the burden of this strange marriage. His eyes occasionally flickered to her, and though he seemed calm, Khadija couldn't help but feel that beneath his confident exterior, he was just as uncertain as she was. When they arrived at the penthouse, the valet opened the door for her, and Jamil stepped out first. Khadija followed him in silence, her heels clicking on the marble floor as they made their way through the lavish entrance. The place was impressive, even by Dubai's extravagant standards. The penthouse had towering glass windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city, with the lights of the skyline casting a golden glow throughout the spacious living room. It was a world far removed from her own, a world she had only ever imagined from afar. "Welcome to your new home," Jamil said, his voice smooth as he led her further inside. Khadija's eyes moved from the luxurious furnishings to the walls adorned with modern art. The space was undeniably beautiful, but it felt cold. She had imagined starting a life with someone she loved, not with a stranger. She forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's stunning," she said, her voice betraying her. Jamil gave a small nod, seemingly unfazed by her lack of enthusiasm. "I'm glad you like it. It's yours now, too." His words hung in the air, but they didn't bring the comfort she hoped for. Khadija felt a sudden wave of dizziness. The magnitude of everything that had happened today, the wedding, the rushed marriage, the strange connection she was supposed to have with this man, was overwhelming. She needed to sit down, to breathe, to collect her thoughts. "I think I need a moment," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamil gave her a brief, understanding look before he nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'll be in my study if you need me." Without another word, he left her alone in the grand living room, and Khadija finally allowed herself to breathe. She sank into one of the plush armchairs, rubbing her temples as she tried to process everything that had happened. "How did I end up here?" she wondered. She had come to Dubai with a dream of starting a life with Tariq, her true love, but now she was married to a man she barely knew, in a world so far removed from her own that it felt like a nightmare. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Hayat. "How are you holding up?" Khadija stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell her friend everything, the confusion, the loneliness, the overwhelming sense that nothing in her life made sense anymore, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Instead, she typed back something simple. "I'm fine, just need to rest, I'll talk to you later." She hit send and dropped the phone on the coffee table. Her mind wandered back to the night's events. The ceremony had been nothing like she imagined, and yet, here she was, sitting in a penthouse with a man who was a stranger to her, trying to navigate a marriage that was nothing more than a contract. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of weakness. What now? She didn't know how to move forward. She didn't know if she was ready to face this new reality. Minutes passed before Jamil returned, his footsteps light against the floor. He was carrying a glass of water in one hand, a quiet offer of peace, as if to acknowledge the tension between them. "Here," he said, handing her the glass. "I know this is difficult. I won't pretend that I understand everything you're feeling, but I want you to know, Khadija, that I'm here. If you need anything, just let me know." Khadija took the glass from him, her fingers brushing his briefly. She looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time since the wedding. His eyes were soft, almost apologetic, and though they were full of warmth, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice hoarse. There was an uncomfortable silence that stretched between them, as though neither of them knew what to say next. Finally, Khadija broke the stillness. "Jamil, why are you doing this?" Her voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of her question. She wasn't sure if she was asking him why he married her, or why he was being so kind when everything about this felt wrong. Jamil's expression shifted slightly, as though he hadn't been expecting her to ask. He sat down opposite her, folding his arms as he looked at her, his gaze steady. "It's complicated," he began, his voice low. "This isn't what I wanted either. But sometimes, life doesn't give us a choice. We're both here because of obligations, Khadija. But that doesn't mean we can't try to make it work, even if it's just for the sake of our families." Khadija nodded slowly, feeling the sting of his words. Obligations. That was what this was. Not love, not choice, just a duty to their families. "I never thought I would end up in a situation like this," she whispered, her eyes searching his for some kind of answer. But all she found was the same uncertainty that was clouding her own heart. Jamil leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. "I know, I didn't ask for this either. But here we are, and we have to make the best of it." Khadija swallowed hard, trying to push down the feelings of betrayal that were threatening to rise in her chest. She had no idea how to make the best of this situation. How could she? But one thing was clear, she had no choice but to go along with it. For now, as the night drew on, Jamil's words echoed in her mind. "We have to make the best of it." Khadija didn't know if she could, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life had changed forever, and there was no going back. The next morning, Khadija woke up in the unfamiliar bed of Jamil's penthouse, the soft sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was alone, the sheets tangled around her body as she sat up slowly, taking in the vast space around her. The room was elegantly furnished, yet it felt cold, devoid of personal touches. It was a luxurious, sterile kind of beauty, one that didn't offer comfort or warmth. It was a world of opulence she never asked to be a part of. Khadija ran a hand through her disheveled hair, trying to gather her thoughts. What was she doing here? She had woken up married to a man she barely knew, and though her mind had replayed the events of the day before, she still felt like it was all a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. She had tried to escape her circumstances, only to find herself trapped in a situation where duty and expectation had taken over her life. There was a soft knock on the door, followed by the sound of it gently creaking open. Khadija looked up to see a maid entering the room with a warm tray of food. "Good morning, Miss Khadija," the maid greeted her with a polite bow. "I've brought your breakfast. Mr. Al-Mansur requested that you eat before starting your day." Khadija forced a smile, still feeling the lingering discomfort in her chest. "Thank you," she replied quietly. The maid placed the tray on the small table beside the bed, and Khadija noticed the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the delicate scent of pastries. She wasn't hungry, but she knew she had to eat. For appearances, if nothing else, she needed to at least pretend that everything was normal. As she picked up a croissant, her phone buzzed beside her on the bed. It was a message from her mother. "You better be behaving yourself, Khadija. This is bigger than just you. Your father expects you to make this work. No turning back now." Khadija sighed, her heart sinking. No turning back. That was all her parents cared about, their image, their reputation. It didn't matter how she felt or what she wanted. They had already made their decision for her. She wasn't a person in their eyes, she was a tool to be used for business, for status, for control. She tried to push the thoughts away as she stood up, taking the tray of food with her. "I can't think about this right now." She had to focus on the present, even if the present felt like a cage. After finishing her meal, Khadija decided to explore the penthouse. She needed to occupy her mind, to escape the overwhelming pressure she felt. She wandered through the spacious living room, admiring the art on the walls and the modern furnishings. Everything was immaculate, pristine, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like a museum, a beautiful, empty museum that belonged to someone else. Her steps led her to a grand staircase that spiraled upward. She hesitated for a moment before slowly ascending, drawn by curiosity. At the top of the stairs, she found a large study. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a massive mahogany desk sat in the center of the room. Jamil's presence lingered in the space, the scent of expensive cologne, the neatness of his belongings, and the quiet authority that seemed to emanate from every corner. Khadija walked around the room, her fingers grazing the spines of the books on the shelves. She had never been a fan of the corporate world that Jamil seemed to thrive in, but something about the quiet of the study spoke to her. It was a place of solitude, of control. A place where decisions were made, where futures were planned. She wondered if Jamil ever found peace in here, or if it, too, was just another reminder of the cage he had built for himself. Just as she was about to leave, she heard footsteps behind her. Khadija turned to find Jamil standing in the doorway, his posture relaxed, but there was a tension in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was dressed in a tailored suit, the dark fabric contrasting sharply against the light of the room. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep, yet softer than usual. "I see you found my study." Khadija nodded, her gaze meeting his. "I needed some time alone," she replied, unsure of how to act around him. Her body was still tense from the events of the previous day, but she wasn't sure if he could tell. He always seemed so composed, so controlled. "I understand," Jamil said, his eyes softening. "This must be difficult for you. I didn't expect things to happen this way, but I want you to know. I'm not going to make this harder for you than it has to be." Khadija raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? I know this isn't the ideal situation," Jamil continued, his voice steady. "But I want to give you the space to figure things out. You're not a prisoner here, Khadija." Khadija stared at him, trying to read his expression. Is he being sincere? She couldn't be sure. He had been polite, even kind, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. As if he knew how to manipulate the situation to his advantage, but he was choosing to act as if he were doing her a favor. "I appreciate that," she said slowly, feeling a small sense of relief. "But what about your family? What about my parents? They're expecting us to uphold this marriage." Jamil's eyes darkened slightly, and for a brief moment, Khadija saw something else in him, a glimpse of the pressure he was under. "My family will accept this for now, though they're not thrilled." "Your parents? I know your father. He's not going to let you walk away from this. But we can find a way to make this work, at least for a while." Khadija wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, she was trapped. Trapped in a marriage she hadn't chosen, in a life she hadn't asked for. But as she looked into Jamil's eyes, she couldn't deny that there was something more to him. Something beyond the businessman, beyond the cold exterior. "You don't have to do this alone," Jamil said quietly, his voice sincere. "I know this was all unexpected, but we can get through this together. I'll help you, Khadija. I won't let you drown in this." For the first time since the wedding, Khadija felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as awful as she thought. But as she looked at Jamil, she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of a complicated, dangerous journey. And in the world they now found themselves in, there was no turning back. The following days in the penthouse felt like a blur to Khadija. She spent most of her time in the lavish but sterile space, trying to adjust to the new rhythm of her life. Jamil was kind, even thoughtful at times, but there was an unspoken distance between them. He seemed to be everywhere, always busy with work, always moving from one meeting to the next. She tried to occupy herself with small tasks, unpacking her belongings, organizing her things, but nothing felt familiar. The house was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't hers. She didn't belong here, and the feeling gnawed at her every day. She missed the warmth of home, the chaotic comfort of her Nigerian family, the bustling streets of Lagos, the vibrant colors, the music, and the laughter. Everything in Dubai was so polished, so perfect, yet it felt empty. Jamil had been respectful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a world she would never understand. He often disappeared for hours at a time, leaving her to her thoughts and the silence of the penthouse. She didn't mind the solitude at first, but after a few days, it began to feel oppressive. One afternoon, as Khadija sat in the living room, leafing through a magazine she found on the coffee table, Jamil returned unexpectedly. His steps echoed in the hallway, and when he entered the room, he seemed both tired and restless. His face softened when he saw her, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "Khadija," he said, his voice less formal than usual. "I hope you're settling in okay." Khadija looked up at him, forcing a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm managing," she said, her tone neutral. Jamil walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling city below. The view from the penthouse was breathtaking, but it felt like a prison to her. She couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at the life she had been thrust into. "I know this isn't easy for you," Jamil continued, his back still to her. And I can't say I understand how you feel, but I want you to know I'm trying. Khadija stood up from the couch, her gaze flicking to his back. I don't think you can understand, she said softly, the frustration in her voice barely hidden. I didn't ask for this, Jamil. I didn't ask for any of this. I'm not just your wife in name. I'm still trying to find myself in all of this. He turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. I didn't ask for this either, he said quietly, his voice filled with a hint of weariness. But we're in it now. And we'll make it work. I won't leave you to handle it alone. Khadija studied him for a moment. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this marriage, this strange arrangement, could eventually lead to something real. But how could she? She had barely known him for a week, and every part of her resisted this idea of playing the role of the perfect wife to a man she didn't love. I don't know if I can, she whispered, more to herself than to him. I don't know if I can just pretend. Jamil stepped closer, his eyes softening. You don't have to pretend, Khadija. But I'm asking you to give this a chance. For us, for our families, and for the future we both have no choice but to face. Khadija's heart raced, torn between her desire for freedom and the reality that she was already tangled in this web. She had always prided herself on her independence, her strength, but now, it felt like everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of, was slipping through her fingers. I just want to know why you agreed to this, Khadija said, her voice cracking slightly. Why did you marry me? You don't know me. You don't love me. Jamil stood still for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost as if he were sharing something he hadn't before. You're right, he said. I don't know you, but I know what my family expects of me. I know the responsibility I have as their heir. But there's more to it than that, Khadija. Her heart skipped a beat. More? Truth is, I don't want a loveless marriage either. I want something more. I'm not saying that I expect you to fall in love with me overnight, but I'm hoping that, in time, we can find some understanding. I'm not asking you to love me right now. I'm asking you to give me a chance, to give us both a chance. Khadija looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw something real, a flicker of vulnerability behind his composed exterior. It was brief, but it was there, and it made her wonder if she had misjudged him. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Jamil, she admitted softly. I don't know if I can just pretend. It feels wrong, but I'm here, and I'm stuck in this. I just need to figure out how to live in it. Jamil nodded slowly, his expression turning more thoughtful. I get that, he said quietly. We have time, Khadija. We don't have to figure it out all at once. We'll take it one day at a time. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for honesty. And for you to give this a chance. Khadija's breath hitched in her chest as she processed his words. She wasn't sure if she could give him what he wanted, but something about his calm presence, his sincerity, made her hesitate. Maybe this wasn't all as black and white as she had thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for something, however small, that could grow into something real. As the day wore on, Khadija couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. She wasn't sure where this marriage would lead, but she knew one thing. It wasn't just about the two families anymore. It was about her, too. And as she sat by the window later that evening, watching the city lights flicker below, she realized that despite everything, despite the uncertainty, she wasn't as alone as she had felt before. She still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't sure it was as hopeless as she once thought. The next few days were a whirlwind of unfamiliar routines. Jamil and Khadija barely spoke outside of the formalities of their new marriage. They exchanged polite words over meals and nodded at each other in passing, but there was still a noticeable distance between them. It wasn't hostility, not at all. It was something else. A sort of mutual understanding that they were both in this situation not by choice, but by necessity. Khadija spent most of her time exploring the city, trying to escape the oppressive silence that hung over the penthouse. It wasn't as though Jamil was unfriendly, he had been patient, respectful, but Khadija couldn't shake the feeling that they were both living in a world of pretense. A world that had been built for them long before either of them had a say. One afternoon, after spending hours wandering around the bustling souks and vibrant streets of Dubai, Khadija returned to the penthouse to find Jamil sitting in his study, papers spread out in front of him. He was still dressed in a sharp suit, his tie slightly loosened, as he reviewed documents with furrowed brows. There was an air of stress about him, a weight that seemed to hang over him even in the calm of his office. Khadija stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. She wanted to speak, to ask how his day had been, but she didn't. Instead, she walked quietly into the room, her footsteps soft on the marble floor. I didn't hear you come in, Jamil said, looking up from his work, his face briefly lighting up at the sight of her. How was your day? Busy, Khadija replied, her voice still a little hesitant. I walked around the souks for a bit, took in the sights. It's different from Lagos. But in a good way, I think. Jamil smiled slightly, setting the papers down and leaning back in his chair. I'm glad you're finding things to do. I know this isn't exactly the life you imagined, but it's all we can do for now. Khadija hesitated. Jamil, she began, her voice more serious now, are we ever going to talk about this? About us? He raised an eyebrow, a subtle shift in his posture as he seemed to take her words in. What exactly do you mean by this? Khadija repeated, trying to gather her thoughts. Our marriage, our life together. It's been days now, and I don't even know how to act. You're kind, but distant. And I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. Jamil sighed, standing up from his desk and walking toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out over the city. I understand. Believe me, I do. But right now, I think we need to focus on what's in front of us. We both know why we're here. Our families expect us to make this work. This marriage, it's not something either of us planned for, but we have to make the best of it. I'm trying, Jamil, Khadija said quietly, her eyes following him. But it's hard. It feels like we're pretending. It feels like I'm just playing a role. I don't want to be some trophy wife or a piece in some corporate game. Jamil turned to face her, his expression softening. I'm not asking you to be any of those things, Khadija. I don't want you to feel like you're playing a role. I'm just asking for patience, for both of us. I know this marriage isn't built on love, but that doesn't mean we can't create something of it. You're not just a pawn in this, not to me. But we have to start somewhere. Khadija bit her lip, considering his words. We have to start somewhere. I don't know where to start, she admitted, feeling vulnerable. I don't even know how to pretend this is okay when it feels like I'm living in someone else's life. Jamil walked over to her, his gaze intense, yet gentle. You don't have to pretend. But we do have to make it through this, Khadija. It's not going to be easy, but I promise you, I'll be here. Whatever you need. Khadija looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of sincerity. It was fleeting, but it was there, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Not for their families, not for the expectations of others, but for themselves. Okay, she whispered, I'll try. The moment felt fragile, like a delicate thread connecting them in a way neither of them fully understood. But it was something. It was more than they had before. And for the first time since the wedding, Khadija allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this marriage could evolve into something real. The next few days brought small changes. Jamil and Khadija began to talk more, though it was still awkward and guarded. They discussed their likes and dislikes, shared stories from their childhoods, and even laughed a little, though it was often forced. It wasn't love, but it was something different. It was an attempt to bridge the gap that had always existed between them. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Jamil broke the silence. I've been thinking, he said, his voice thoughtful. Maybe it's time we stop living like strangers in this house. Khadija raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I think it's time we start doing things together, he said with a slight smile. I'm not saying we should suddenly become best friends or act like a happily married couple, but maybe we should find some common ground. Go out, experience life together, not just in this penthouse, but in the world. Khadija considered this. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Maybe this was how they would start. Slowly, carefully, building something from the foundation they had. I'd like that, she said softly. It's a start, isn't it? Jamil nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting in a subtle smile. It's a start. And so, for the first time since their marriage, Khadija allowed herself to hope that there was a future for them. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be perfect, but it was theirs. And maybe that was enough. Weeks passed, and Khadija and Jamil continued to navigate the uncharted waters of their marriage. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when Khadija wanted to break free from the chains of obligation, but there were also moments of genuine connection, small glimpses of understanding between them that made her wonder if something more could come from this. Jamil had kept his word. They went out more, visiting art galleries, attending dinner parties, and even taking weekend trips to the desert. They explored the city together, sometimes with an air of formality, but at times, in the quiet spaces between conversations, they laughed. There was an ease that began to develop, a shared rhythm that allowed them to breathe without the constant tension that had once consumed the air between them. One evening, as they walked along the Dubai marina, the bright city lights reflecting off the water's surface, Khadija found herself smiling more genuinely than she had in weeks. It was simple, yet peaceful, something she hadn't realized she was craving. "Khadija," Jamil said softly, his hand brushing against hers, "I know we didn't start this marriage with love, but do you ever think there's a chance we could grow into it?" Khadija stopped in her tracks, the sound of the bustling city fading as she turned to face him. His eyes were earnest, filled with a sincerity that had once been hard to read but was now unmistakable. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "But I think we could try. Maybe we can find something real, even if it's not the fairy tale we expected." Jamil smiled, and for the first time since their wedding, there was a warmth to it, a connection that spoke louder than words. "That's all I'm asking for. A chance." They continued their walk, and for once, Khadija didn't feel like she was playing a part. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't caught between expectations and reality. She was simply there, living in the moment, with Jamil by her side, unsure of what tomorrow would bring, but certain that whatever came, they would face it together. A few months later, on a quiet evening at their penthouse, Khadija sat on the balcony, gazing out over the city. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. The stress of her wedding day, the confusion, the fear, it all seemed like a distant memory now. Jamil came out to join her, handing her a glass of wine. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. "I know it hasn't been easy, and maybe we're still figuring things out, but I think we've come a long way." Khadija took the glass from him, her fingers brushing against his, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something more, a spark that had slowly ignited over the weeks. She had learned to appreciate the small moments, the quiet gestures, and the unspoken understanding they shared. "I think you're right," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Maybe we'll never have the kind of love story we thought we would, but we have something else. Something that's ours." Jamil looked at her, his expression gentle, and as the city lights twinkled in the distance, he leaned in, brushing his lips against hers in a tender kiss. It wasn't passionate, but it was real. It was a kiss of two people who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways, two people who had built something from the ground up, and despite everything, had made it work. When they pulled away, Khadija looked at him, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "You know, I never thought I'd say this," she said, her voice a little teasing, "but I think I'm starting to love this crazy life." Jamil's smile deepened, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I'm glad to hear that, Khadija. I think we're both in the right place now." Together, as they stood there, looking out over the city that had become their new home, Khadija realized that maybe it wasn't the love she had expected. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the future.